Please welcome Apotonic.
Check, check, check. Hello. Good morning, everyone. I was supposed to speak at 12, or was it 11? Or I don't know. So thanks for having me here, guys. Last time I was at Wroclaw, I gave I tried to give a keynote, but that was different. I was standing over there and I was drunk. This time I'm here and I'm only hungover, so it's going to be way better. And actually, this talk is crowdfunded. While you guys were having lunch, these guys over here were working on my slides, so I have absolutely no idea what they put into my slides. But please, a random applause to my slide boys. Great, guys. So I had this incredible funny joke that I'm not Nick, but I'm Luca Guigi, because it was kind of funny. I mean, it was funny. It's not funny anymore because I'm speaking at now and not at 11. So because apparently Luca disappeared, so I got his slot. So I'm Luca Guigi, whatever. Yeah, that's me. I'm from Italy. It's a great country in Europe. We have pizza and yeah, it's ciao bella, and we have a funny way of talking to each other. So if you have any questions about Italian or about this country, feel free to hit me up later at the party. But hurry up because I might be drunk again. Speaking of drunk, yesterday was great. This is the photos I found on my camera in reverse order. So apparently I had a kebab before I went to bed. That's why I didn't have to have lunch. And we had lots of. This is vodka. This is us after drinking vodka. That's me trying another. So there's different kinds of vodkas. Actually, this is Italian vodka I brought from Italy. My camera got drunk as well, and we were having so much fun. There were so many beautiful moments yesterday. And at some point I had this red scarf, and it's on every photo. I'm wearing a red scarf. This is because I'm from Italy. We're really fashionable. I should stop that now because it's racist. Yeah, I was having a good time. I don't know about you guys. And so even though there were only 3 talks yesterday, we already partied like there's 2 days of conference behind us. Always under the watchful eyes of NJ, who told me not to get too drunk on Friday. And yeah, of course, we just partied a little bit. And yeah, so can we just get through those slides? Thank you, because I always put it the way I'm respecting local traditions when we hang out at the pub. So yeah, and it's actually really cold because I came from Brazil. Last week I was speaking in Brazil. I didn't bring any winter equipment. I mean, it's not that I'm European and I know how it is in March in Europe. No, I just came like this. Brought my beanie. So thanks to Mihao, who gave me his beautiful coat. Oh, and I had another döner, apparently, because there's more photos with döner kebab on my camera. Yep, okay, so let's talk about Rails. So, are we talking about Lotus or about Trailblazer? Let's talk about Rails first. Who's doing Rails in this audience? That is more than in Brazil. Wow. Who does Ruby? That's great. It's a cool programming language. I'll start doing Rust after this talk. So Rails has a problem. It is called, or I call it, MV-citis. And the problem is that Rails still, after 10 years, tries to implement complex software, really like the most complex software you can think of, with 3 abstraction layers. We got the view, we got the controller, and the model, and Rails calls it MVC. So what a usual application ends up with a monolithic setup with huge classes, usually massive models, massive controllers, and views full of code. And people don't like this. But for some reason, people don't take action, especially the Rails core team does not provide us additional abstraction layers. So when when you start to introduce additional objects, additional abstraction layers in Rails, it's often considered enterprise, or you're too enterprise, you're too over-engineering a simple thing. And the thing about Rails is simple, and that's will tell you, every Rails developer will tell you that Rails is simple. And actually, I love that about Rails, and I call it the Rails Girls effect, which I don't know if you guys know Rails Girls. It's a fantastic setup where 50 girls learn how to program because they have never seen a programming language before within 2 days. So, and they learn how to program with Ruby on Rails, and this is something, because Rails is simple, and this is something I don't wanna miss in Rails. But Rails is only simple for a 3 minutes block or for a 15 minutes block or whatever. And so I've never heard anyone say Rails is simple. It allows me to structure complex applications. And this is what, so this is a result of this monolithic, extremely simplified architecture in Rails. I could say architecture, but I could also say architecture because it's just a minimalistic setup to abstract your code. So we got the model, view, and controller in Rails. I'm quickly going to run or walk you through this, through the examples that yield to this architecture. So it's a lot of code, and it's still early for me. So a controller in Rails usually has a lot of different structural code in one class. So what we have is we always find filters in controllers. So there's like authentication or environmental setup, and all that stuff sits in a filter. And then we have model setup. So we grab models, we find models, we work on the model. So this is partly business code. Then we have environmental deciders. So we have like we decide if it's going to be if you're signed in, we check out the environment, if the user is logged in and all that stuff. And then we have callbacks or logic that should be that should not be sitting in the controller is dispatched in the controller as well, like notifications, like sending out emails or logging something. That's all sitting in the controller. And then we have the beautiful rendering code as well, which is stuffed into the same controller action. Sorry, I have to drink something because one problem with alcohol is that the next day you have a really dry mouth. Alrighty. The model, my favorite part in Rails. Usually the model ends up with a lot of configuration code for forms. You have configuration for accessing the model, accessing the parameters, what is allowed to go into the model and what is not allowed. So it ends up with this Rails way of configuring different aspects of your software. And my absolute favorite thing in Rails is the way callbacks are added to models. So a callback is meant to extend your business logic, so you can add or extend certain steps of your object lifecycle, like before the validation, after saving, during the creation process, and this is all added to the model in one central place. So we all have this problem that when you add callbacks to a model, and you actually don't want to run this callback, you have a problem. So, and this is a result because everything gets stuffed into one single class in Rails in the model. And of course, it's not only configuration, it's not only callbacks, it's also all your business code sits in the model. I don't even want to talk about this because I've seen long classes in my life. So the view. Who puts logic into the view? No one here. Ah, one brave guy. Because we don't have logic in views, right? It's a no-go. Like we don't do it, but people always do it, like all the time. And I don't actually have a problem with logic. I only have a problem with complexity in views. And views are complex because Rails is made to allow us to write user interface-driven applications. Yeah, most of the Rails applications we write are with a user interface. So that means a lot of logic goes into the view. and is view related. So what happens is model code sits in the view, deciders, environmental deciders, is the guy logged in, is the guy a standard user, is it an admin, render this or this or this. So there's a lot of environmental code in the view, and then we have what they call helpers in order to clean up our views. A helper is hi. A helper is just a global function in Ruby where people stuff even more code into completely object-unoriented functions where they have configurations, where they have options sitting, where they have more deciders in functions that are globally accessible in every view. And it's a nice attempt to introduce those helpers, but it doesn't really help to introduce an architecture in your Rails app. So model view controller. When you think about why we have this, when you think about it, to me, a classy Rails application, a classy Rails request boils down to a couple of steps that are everywhere in every request. So we start with a dispatch a dispatch in the controller where we either decide whether to handle the HTML version of the page or the JSON version or all that stuff. So we got the dispatch. Then we got authorization, which figures out, are we okay to run this business logic? Are we okay to render this page? Is the user signed in? Is it an admin? Then we have validation for incoming parameters. So we make sure that everything that is sent into the action is okay. Then we run the actual business logic, which is the code you guys write. We might access the persistence. Oh, cool, he brought his own notebook to take notes of my incredible, amazing talk. Thank you, that's great. So we might access the persistence layer and to save stuff or to query stuff, and then in the end we render a result. Okay, so that's a classy Rails stack for every request. Dispatch, authorization, validation, business logic, persistence, and the rendering of the result. And in Rails, this is stuffed into 3 layers: controller, model, and view. In Trailblazer, this is different. If you're a good friend of mine, you might find yourself in one of the Trailblazer illustrations in my book, because there's a book. And the book comes with a free colorful front illustration and 10 illustrations in the chapters, stuffed with people I know. So if you're nice to me, you might find yourself somewhere. In Trailblazer, this is different. In Trailblazer, we still have the same stack as in Rails. We still have the model, we still have controllers, and we still have views. But Trailblazer brings additional abstraction layers. This diagram, I mean, you look at it and you think it's just a diagram, but it was a massive amount of workload for me. It took me actually 10 hours to do this diagram. So you better respect it. I love it. All right, so in Trailblazer, we got what I call an operation, the concept of operations, which is the place where we put our business logic, our validation, our authorization, and sometimes even the rendering. Yeah. So I quickly walk you through the layers. But one thing I want to note before, because in the last talk I forgot to talk about this, is that Trailblazer brings you a completely new structure of your files, of your assets in your application. So instead of having app controller, blah, 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 app view, blah, 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 you have app concepts, and then you have a folder, a directory for the concept, as I call it, you're working on. Yeah, like the concept in this example is I'm trying to add or update comments to something. So in Trailblazer, you have, we call it like concept-driven structuring. And this yields to a really like neat and modular file structure. So what I hated in Rails is when you work on one concept, you have to jump through 4 or 5 directories in order to grab all the files you need. Let's say you rename comments to, I don't know, notes. You have to jump through directories and all that. It's just an example, not that you have to rename all your stuff. But Trailblazer kind of structures and groups this into one directory per concept. Yeah, so you have views, you have your cells, you have your form, your operation, all sitting in one directory. All right, so in order to show you how Trailblazer works, I was actually asked to make this talk really technical. It was only like a little bit technical and a lot of like, hey, open source and inspiration and it's cool. But this is not desired at this conference, so I put a lot of tech stuff in it. Is that cool? Hey, by the way, we got electricity. Yay! Okay, so I'll just walk you through all the different layers in Trailblazer with brief code examples. Please don't hit me up later and tell me like your examples were too simple or something, because I'm really trying to make this as understandable as possible, but it might be a little bit too simplistic for some people because everyone in this room is really smart. So let's have a look at the controller. Controllers in Trailblazer are completely empty endpoints. Yeah, there's no business logic in the controller anymore. All the business logic is automatically dispatched to the operation. So instead of having deciders, instead of having environmental code in the controller, we just dispatch to an operation in Trailblazer. Yep. Lotus. Trailblazer? Oh, doesn't matter. All right, so the controller dispatches to the operation. In Trailblazer, we still have models. So you can use active record, you can even use Lotus model if you want, because it's awesome. Is Luca going to come, by the way, or is he going to stay in? So he's not going to show up. Too bad. He's a great guy. I don't know what happened to him. Did he just miss his plane, or? Okay. If this is recorded, Luca, cheers to Italy. All right, so the model layer in Trailblazer gives you all the freedom of the ORMs we have in Rails, in Ruby. Sorry, you can use data mapper, you can use ROM, you can use active record, but with one restriction: you don't use business code, and you don't use callbacks, and you don't use validations in your models anymore. So what you do is you have empty models with association configuration and with finders. So you can have finders, you can use all the joins and all the awesome stuff that active record gives you, but without any additional fuzzy, weird business code in your model. A lot of people use Trailblazer in existing apps. They still have business code in their models. They still have validation sitting in their models, and I don't kill them because it still works. This is only a guideline. And it's actually, I mean, let me go back to this. It's actually beautiful to have empty models, because suddenly a model does only persistence, and that is a great feeling. Makes me sleep at night. I didn't get too much sleep yesterday, but that's another story. The views in Trailblazer is the same with models and controllers. You can do whatever you want. You can have logic, so you can use helpers. You can use partials. You can use controller views. So I do use a lot of controller views without using the Cells gem, which I'm going to introduce next. So you're free to use Rails view layer the way you want, but we have this. So we're still in the making of a guideline for the view, because I mean I can tell you if it gets too complex to use a view component, but what is complexity? That's still to be clarified in Trailblazer. But the message is use views. If you cannot follow anymore, then use a view component, which is what Cells brings to Trailblazer. So you either use the old Rails way of implementing your view, or what we call view model from the Cells gem. So Cells is, I don't know, there was a lightning talk yesterday, so I don't have to talk about this, because you guys were all listening to that lightning talk, right? Everyone is staring at the screen like, oh my God. So Cells is perfect to encapsulate little pieces of your UI, or widget as we call them, to model those widgets into a component, into an encapsulated object. So for example, here is I'm still working in a bikini company, and we have this community where people can like comment on photos and stuff. So for example, one comment, usually you'd use a partial to render a comment. This is a perfect application for Cells, so you encapsulate every comment box with its own cell, because there's lots of logic in every comment. There's like, is this user a staff member? Where's the avatar? When was this comment posted? Do we have to sanitize the body text and all that stuff? So a lot of logic comes together in this little box. So a perfect application for Cells. And a cell is called like a helper. So you actually use a helper, which is called cell, and dispatch to the actual new class. And I'll just show you briefly how a cell looks. So a cell, to encapsulate this view part, is a simple class. So it's derived from cell view model, and the details don't matter. The whole point about a cell is you always have a show method, and this is the one that renders the actual content. And we still have views in cells, so you can use Haml, you can use ERB, but the views in cells end up as really, really, really simple logic-less templates, yeah, the way they should be. Because the cool thing in cells is, and I'm really, really proud of this, is that when you call a method in a view, like the avatar method, for example, this method is not called in a helper stack somewhere. This method is called on the cell instance. So it's really, really simple in cells to write maintainable view code, because you don't have fuzzy methods sitting in some global helper space. You call a method, and this method is called on the cell object. So you can simply encapsulate helpers. You can use inheritance. You can override helpers per cell class and not in your global namespace. And I decided, because this is a really technical talk, but only 30 minutes talk, that I'm not going to talk about cells in detail in this talk. Oh, did you just check your watch to signalize that I should hurry up or something? So I think there's another lightning talk today about cells, right? I saw that on this board, so maybe we're going to learn some more aspects. What I'm trying to tell is cells helps you to encapsulate parts of your view. You can even have the entire view encapsulated in a cell. It helps you to structure your view and to use object orientation, yeah, in your view, because that's what's missing in Rails completely. Like there's nothing, there's not a structure, there's no inheritance. It's basically a template engine with PHP code. That's what I usually say. And so the main part in Trailblazer is the new addition is the operation layer. I call it the domain layer. So an operation is surprisingly a class in Trailblazer, and the operation keeps or maintains a contract or a form object. So every operation comes with a built-in form object, and with one method you have to implement. It's called process. That's where your business code sits. And I want to talk about the form object first, and then about the business code. So every operation comes with a contract or a form object, and this is configured directly in the operation. And this was on so Trailblazer was on a podcast the other day, and people were like, "Yeah, this looks cool, but it looks really it looks like it's just a big DSL." Which is, of course, not true, because I hate DSLs, but it's really handy to configure, to implement your form object in the operation itself. So what happens here, what happens here is that all the operation does for you is create a reform object, because the form object in Trailblazer is handled with the reform gem, and allocates a new class for you where you can configure your form object. And the business code in an operation goes into the process method. The process method is the only public method in an operation, or should be the only public method. And this is where you can take advantage of the form object. This is where you can work on your model, where you create stuff, where you send out callbacks and all that, where you actually run callbacks and all that stuff. I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail now. So just to give you an overview where Trailblazer implements my 6-level stack. So instead of trying to implement this these steps desired for every application in MVNC, Trailblazer basically comes with additional abstraction layers for all the kinds of tasks you have in every Rails application. So dispatch still happens in the controller, rendering is still in the view layer, model is persistence only, and the rest of the business logic sits in an operation. And a lot of people say, oh, well, this is great, but now you just move all the business code into one class. So great. So again, monolithic setup. But this is not true, because it's the watchful eyes of Andrew. So what Trailblazer does is we do not just move all the business logic into one class. Actually, an operation is an orchestrating instance that uses a lot of different instances, like the form object, like a representer, or your model, to delegate, to orchestrate between all the necessary assets you need for to handle your request, to handle your business logic. So it's not just this. We took the code and moved it into a new class, like helpers, and like, hey, yeah, that's it. It's actually we thought a lot about where to put what kind of code. So, for example, the form object in an operation took us weeks and months. When I say we, I say I, but I'm 2 or 3 personalities. So it took a long time to figure out how to structure this operation stuff. And the thing I love about this operational domain encapsulation thing in Trailblazer is that it actually gives me a high-level API I can talk about. Because so you might be wondering, what's a high-level API? Because this is a word I made up. So let's say you have a Rails application, and you can, like, I made this example. It's like a coffee shop app, so you can view a coffee shop, then you can add a comment to a coffee shop, and then you can follow a shop and all that stuff. So if you think about your application from a user perspective, every click a user can do is a high-level API action. So in Rails we should start thinking in high-level API. Like what does the application actually do? Because in Rails you don't think about high-level APIs. You think about, here's my model, here's a controller. The controller has 7 CRUD actions and additional AJAX actions to handle this and that. So we don't talk about what does the application do. We always talk about the implementation, details. So Trailblazer gives me this this high-level thinking of my application, because I encapsulate the logic in operations. So an operation is basically what I call an entry point for the user to modify your application state. And in Rails, I mean, yeah, this usually happens with so the high-level entry point is partly in the controller. Then the model does some steps in this, and the view does a lot of adds a lot of logic to implement this. Like, for example, when I view a shop, this is implemented in the controller, a little bit in the model, a little bit in the view. Or even worse, when I add a comment, yeah, to my like when I add a comment to a shop. So in Rails, this is like adding comments is usually done in. There's a lot of stuff in the controller. You might add parameters and stuff, or you might change, or you use strong parameters to verify the input is correct. So a lot of logic sits in the controller. Then also the model does like loads of work in order to implement adding a comment. It might validate. It might set up an object graph and all that stuff. And then the view does the same. So the view will add additional code to implement this simple step of adding a comment. And yeah, so usually the view is like the view is involved in every single step in a Rails app. And so also the tests on Rails, I never really know what I'm supposed to test and how. So the controller tests partly the controller, partly the model. The unit test for the model partly tests the controller code, because you need strong parameters and all that stuff. And functional tests basically test everything, but not really. So when I want to test adding a comment in Rails, I don't really know how to structure it. And in Trailblazer, this is really simple, because the only thing the controller does is dispatching, and then the view, the only thing it does is rendering the response, and everything else happens in the operation. So the structuring is really clear, and and also the testing is really simple. So in Trailblazer, when I want to test adding a comment, I write a smoke test for the controller just to make sure the controller works. Everything else is tested in a unit test for the operation. I don't need to have model tests. I don't need to have controller tests that make sure this works in that context and this works in that environment. I just test the operation and every edge case in a unit test. And to test the view, we just have functional tests that test the or assert the HTML. So the structuring in Trailblazer is really like straightforward. So when I have to test something in Trailblazer, I don't need to think like, okay, is it going to be a controller test, or is it going to be like, am I going to write a functional test that walks through all those steps? No, I just have operation tests. And just to give you an idea about this operation, how it looks in detail. So the cool thing about structuring your business code into operations is they are reusable. So you can use them in a controller. You can also use operations in your tests. So this is how you would run an operation in a test. And you can also use operations as factories. So we don't have to use model code anymore. We don't need factories from factory goal, all that stuff. We just use operations in order to create, in order to update, in order to modify business code. And you can also use operations in scripts or from the console, and it's always the same syntax. So you don't have to think about any environmental differences. And operations are not just only CRUD. Yeah, you dispatch in order to create a comment or something, and then you render the response. Operations also, so in my example, I'm just creating one comment. Yeah, I run the operation, it creates a comment, done. Really simple example, but an operation is not limited to CRUD. Like you can handle multiple models in one operation, and it's not limited to like the simple example I did. You can run every kind of code you want in an operation. It's not limited to just creating something or just updating an object. You can add an arbitrary code. I don't know, like set up an object graph, send out notifications, whatever you want. And the form object is not required, so you don't need to use the form object in an operation, but it greatly helps to reduce your business code, because what we do is we just configure the fields of the form, the fields of the input, and we configure the validations. Yeah, so I just use property and validates, and this will so again, this is not just a DSL. This in the background, this creates a reform class for you. So you can have your forms in a separate file if you want that. You don't have to push all that into the operation. Yeah, it's really simple. And you can have nested forms and all that stuff, like all the stuff that reform gives you. I'm not going to go into detail here because I want to get to the after party. So you can have nested form setups, you can have nested validations, all that kind of stuff that reform brings you in your operation. And what's that? I didn't add this slide. I think it's, are you trying to tell me to hurry up? Okay, I'm almost done. So the way Trailblazer offers you the form object is with the validate method. So the validate method in the operation runs the validation and makes sure everything is in line with the configured validation, and then the block inside the validate method is run. So that's where you run your business logic. And what basically happens when you validate the incoming data in an operation is the Trailblazer sets up a form object, then it deserializes the input, which is usually a hash. It could also be JSON, sets up an object graph, runs the validation on that object graph. So there might be a comment with an author, and an author might have a, I don't know, log object or whatever. So, but this all happens without writing or reading from the database. This is all decoupled from persistence yet. And then the only time when the operation actually works with persistence layer is when you save something. So validation happens without addressing the database. And the way you dispatch callbacks happens in an explicit way. So you just add your callbacks where you want them. So when, for example, after I save my model, I just add the callbacks underneath this save block in a really explicit way. So there's no way to magically add or remove callbacks. I mean, there is a way, namely this. So you can also configure your callbacks in a more generic way, which helps you to, so when I add, it's my favorite slide. So when I add callbacks with the dispatch method, this helps me to take advantage of inheritance. By the way, did you know that you can tell if someone is like someone is derived from another person if they can do? Can you do that, the tongue roller? Because it's funny because my sister can't, but I can. I did mention that I have a twin sister, right? What else? Little finger straight or crooked? Yeah, whatever. So inheritance in Trailblazer is a big, not this kind of inheritance, the real inheritance and object orientation is a big thing in Trailblazer. So in order to customize or to add additional actions to your high-level API, for example, to update for an update operation, I simply inherit from the create operation, and then you have a really fine tools for fine tuning. So I can say, okay, in the update action, I don't want to run this callback or whatever. So this is something that is impossible in Rails because there is no real way to distinguish between update, create, and all that stuff. And when you start inheriting from models, there's no way to say, okay, but don't run this particular callback. In Trailblazer, this is kind of built in because Trailblazer is all about inheritance and using object orientation. And you can also the way the contract, the form object also gets inherited, but Trailblazer gives you like really simple tools to customize inherited contracts. So you can so what I do is I inherit the create contract and then I fine tune. So I say, okay, when I update something, I don't want to have the body field to be writable. So I set it to read only, and this helps me to minimize the code I need in my. I need to implement all this, all the business code. And yeah, so also the way we handle different setups for, is the user logged in? Is it an admin? Is it an unregistered user? This is all handled with inheritance. But what looks like a huge inheritance setup usually ends up in a really, really small chain of inheriting operations because we can fine-tune everything locally in the inherited class. Yeah, like you can assign Trailblazer, okay, if some special condition is met, don't instantiate the create operation, instantiate the admin create operation. So builder code, polymorphic dispatcher is built into Trailblazer as well. It's just a quick example. Don't look at it. For me, this is too much tech. I would love to talk about my open source career. Also, a really cool thing, and that's the last thing I'm going to talk about here, is how Trailblazer allows you to handle. So this was all about forms and like a hash input, but it also allows you to handle JSON or XML or whatever. So an operation can also receive a JSON string, and since we configured the contract, the operation kind of knows how to deserialize JSON, how to handle this document, how to deserialize this into an object, because we already have the entire information in the contract configured. And this happens by using representable. So representable helps to deserialize and to serialize documents in an operation. So operations can handle both hash and documents with XML or JSON. And again, we have fine-tuning. If you want to fine-tune, if your form doesn't look like the XML, or if your form doesn't look like the JSON, you have the opportunity, the possibility to fine-tune that in the representer block. So that's all like DSL details we don't have to figure out. The cool thing is, Rails core, we were having a panel last week in Brazil. Brazil, like summer and like board shorts and topless and stuff. Yeah, you don't need a winter jacket in Brazil. And the Rails core team is actually really interested in this approach. So it's not like I'm building this alternative stack to fuck off the Rails core team. It's more like we're trying to help out each other, because I think the Rails core team has finally concluded that this minimalistic setup that we find is not enough to handle complex applications. So it was really interesting to have this panel and to see the guys actually learn about Trailblazer or about alternative structurings of your application. It was really cool to see that there's an open mindset in Rails. So it's not everything is just opinionated and everything is going to be the way some charismatic leaders say. No, I think the Rails core team is in a state of change at the moment. Okay, so Trailblazer brings you additional abstraction layers. We have tons of more features, like polymorphic operations and reform in cells and all this stuff. So Trailblazer is made out of a lot of gems, which you can look up in the internet, but you don't need to go on the internet because you can just purchase my book. leanpub.com/Trailblazer. 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 So the book is 66% done, according to LeanPub. I don't have any idea how they know that it's 66% done. I would say it's halfway there. It is already covering all the major aspects of Trailblazer: operations, forms, view models, dispatch code in the controller, testing. So if you're interested in Trailblazer, please support my work and get this book. I'm promising to write more chapters. And to close this, keep in mind that business code and complex applications don't need to be implemented in huge monolithic MVC, but can be in separate layers. Start thinking in high-level APIs and not in Rails internals. Use all my gems and give me all your money. And enjoy the after party. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Nick. We'll get to the questions, but before that, I have a question. Did you leave your socks in Brazil?
Great story. I have socks. I have socks. Now look at this. They're special socks I bought in Taiwan. Brought them all the way to Australia, took them to Mexico, then to Brazil, and then to Poland. And that's why I have socks.
Okay. You might consider washing them.
Yes, washing, yeah, but you don't have electricity, so I'm supposed
Yes, we do. Normally we do. Most of the time. Okay. So, a big hand again for Nick.
Thank you, guys. You're awesome.
It's hard to even imagine how genius he would be without the drinking. Any questions? We have a couple of minutes for questions. Go ahead.
So you said you don't like DSL, but don't you think that Trailblazer is yet another DSL on top of the DSL that we already have? Can't we do this in Rails?
Well, in order to take advantage of a framework, you usually need a DSL, or you need a really, really good, well-structured API. Like, you know, form object, you have the form object, we have the business code, we have the representer to deserialize or serialize stuff, and Trailblazer just offers you this DSL to use the API, because actually there is no DSL. We don't have like hidden classes. What Trailblazer just does is it creates classes for you using a DSL. So I could use reform directly in an operation without using the DSL. It's just like I did it so many times that I decided, okay, let's put this into Trailblazer core. And I don't think this is possible with Rails itself. Like the way we structure applications in Trailblazer is you put your application code into operations, and this is completely missing in Rails. So I don't know how Rails and Rails DSL would do the same in a simpler way. Do you have any examples, or like?
Yeah, I'm just asking, but fair enough.
Yeah, that's
thanks.
a valid question. Like I know that it might look overly complex as all my gems, but it's actually a result of years of how am I going to structure this, and the DSL is so minimalistic that it's actually, I find it extremely helpful. And another thing is inheritance. In Trailblazer we have a lot of inheritance because we don't have deciders, we use polymorphic object orientation, but that's again the same. Like it's really minimalistic. The code you usually override in derived classes is a few lines of code, and sometimes you don't even need to derive code. So DSL and inheritance is what shocks most people about Trailblazer in the beginning. It's the second time you drop your notebook. It's because you're taking so many notes, but you don't need notes. You can just buy my book. Okay, so DSL and inheritance, don't get confused, don't get scared, because this is actually object orientation the way it was meant to be, and not like pseudo object orientation that we find in Rails. Any other questions?
One more question. Anybody?
I never do question and answer usually after my talks, because I hate this break between questions, and then it takes like 25 seconds for people to like, okay, let's ask.
Sometimes.
And this is really awkward.
I mean, I think people are just so embarrassed to ask you questions.
Or maybe because of you, because you're the attractive, dynamic guy, and they get nervous.
I wanted to ask a question, but I'll skip that. Okay. If you don't have any more questions, or you're too scared to ask them openly, find Nick and ask him in the break, or tonight.
Or tomorrow. I'm actually in Wrocław till Wednesday, so if you want to hang out with me, please do, because I'll be lonesome and bored.
Okay, thanks
Thank
again. We'll be